in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast. The reason why we fatigue is so our muscles don't blow themselves apart. It's a protective mechanism.
Right.
So if we don't have mechanisms to then control metabolic acidosis and temperature in place, then we are essentially cooking ourselves from the inside out. The body has figured out ways to cope with runaway, like acidosis and heat and other things like that. And it's called, at least from an exercise perspective, fatigue. Welcome to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined once again by Coach Dave Schell of Kaizen Endurance for another episode of Fast Physiology. In today's episode of Fast Physiology, we are going to talk all things fatigue, from the physiology and the basis of fatigue to the mechanisms of fatigue. Enjoy. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Filbert.
Oh, man. Yeah, I need to just start calling you David or I don't even know, because I know that you wouldn't like it. And I think it would be a little funny. But anyways, it's Dr. Filbert, actually, Dave.
Yeah, exactly. Show me my respect.
Yeah, exactly. Show some respect, gosh darn it. But yeah, today on Fast Physiology, we're going to talk about fatigue. And this is one of those really interesting physiology topics that I think a lot of people think they know about. But there's been a lot of research that has come out, in more recent years that kind of points towards different mechanisms of fatigue. And we still don't fully, admittedly, we still don't fully understand, all the basis of fatigue, very similarly to cramping, right? So we don't understand, fully mechanistically where cramping is coming from. We don't understand fully mechanistically where fatigue is coming from. But I think we have, some large ideas about how fatigue is accumulated, where it's coming from, and other things like that. So Dave, if you wouldn't mind just letting me know, what do you hope to get out of this, sort of discussion about fatigue?
Yeah, I think for me, what's interesting is that, I think what you just said is that we don't really know. It's multifactorial in that a lot of things contribute to it, and that it can never be pinpointed to any one thing. And I think that's what's been interesting for me is if we did a podcast on W prime or anaerobic work capacity, and it's like they've done things where people exercise to fatigue and then did a muscle biopsy, but there was still like ATP or whatever available in the muscle. So it's like, okay, well, there was still a reserve there. So why'd they fatigue? And so it's like trying to figure that out. And I think that's a good place to start there.
Yeah. So let's start with a definition of fatigue. The definition that I like is an inability to maintain force production even though you want to. So it's not, like a psychological, I'm tired, so I'm stopping. It's I want to keep exercising at this power output or speed, but my body no longer is allowing me to be able to do so.
Yeah. And I laugh at that because I think that's such a key part of it is want to.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like by that definition, it's really like, for lack of a better term, almost muscle failure, where you're trying, but your muscle just your body's not cooperating at that point.
Right. Something is happening at, close to, or within the muscle that is not allowing you to create the force that is necessary to keep you doing the activity that you want to do, which is different than, say, psychological fatigue, which would be, I'm riding at 300 watts and for some reason it's just hurting too much or something is happening where you just, are psychologically don't want to do it anymore. And that's a whole different can of worms that I don't want to open up because it's talk about murky. Like the psychology is way more murky than physiology, and physiology is already pretty murky. So,
right.
So yeah, let's start. We'll start with that level or that definition of fatigue, and then I think from there's kind of two branching definitions of fatigue. There's like acute fatigue. So that's like acute failure. If you were lifting weights or something like that, it'd be like you went to go and bench another rep and you just simply weren't able to move the bar anymore. And then there's chronic fatigue, which you really only see at the end of potentially like an Ironman or really, really grueling ultra marathon races where it's like you see, and you can see it when you actually like, witness this sort of thing, is like the person wants to try to get to the finish line, but their body's just like, no, I'm good. Like it literally is shutting down. And this is like, there's videos of people who are like stumbling and weaving back and forth on the, on the course or like other things like that. That's what I would define as chronic fatigue.
Okay.
So typically that doesn't happen very often. That it does take a really, really large effort, to get to that point. Typically other systems are going to fail before you would get to the point where your muscles just stop working altogether. But there are certain cases and certain scenarios where it's hot, you're depleting all of your glycogen, amongst a ton of other factors that just cause your body to shut down. And this is where, you see the people, trying to crawl across the finish line because their legs just simply don't work anymore. So I would say that's kind of a little bit tertiary, but I do want to talk about it because listeners of this podcast, we have a range from, people who are running, like 800s to a mile all the way to completing ultra marathons and like super far ultra marathons, like, 100, 150, 200-mile races and stuff like that. So I just want to talk to it from that perspective. So now where do we go? Do we dive into the muscle and start to talk about fatigue from that perspective or what?
Yeah. And I think, as you're talking, I start thinking about the next logical progression of this discussion. And it's really like, well, what do people want to know? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, we want to know, like, how do we prevent our pace from falling off or our power from falling off over the course of a race? And so, what is it at the end of a 3-hour race or 5-hour race? What are the factors that are causing us to slow down? And then how do we address that in training to become more fatigue resistant over time?
Yeah. So I think the best definition is just to, look at the stress of exercise and then, start to understand what is actually happening, at least from what we know from research, what is actually happening that could be potentially causing fatigue. And again, if the definition of fatigue is an inability to create the force necessary to do the exercise that you want to be doing, then we have to start looking at, okay, well, what at the level of the muscle could be interfering with our ability to create force? So force is generated by myosin and actin cross bridges forming within the muscle and then essentially walking across each other and contracting the muscle, relaxing, contracting the muscle, relaxing. And amongst that, what needs to happen is you need to be able to propagate an electric signal from your nerves through the muscle to release calcium, which then goes and binds to certain components of myosin and actin, and then allows for cross bridge formation to occur. When your cross bridges form, you need the breakdown of ATP to release and re-establish the potential for movement. So it cocks the catapult. That's kind of what we talk about. And I'm really glossing over this because we only have 20 minutes. This is typically like a 2-hour lecture on just how muscle contraction actually occurs. So I'll probably, if people are interested, I'll make a deeper, video on how muscle contraction actually occurs. But we need ATP in order to reload the catapult in order to be able to then, break it down and move, like our essentially contract. Right. So that's where our ATP is coming from. Calcium is important because you'll see in just a minute if calcium flux gets messed up, then we might fatigue. So we need enough ATP. At the end of the day, ATP generation is kind of what is driving either you're fatiguing or you're not fatiguing. So as you exercise harder and harder and harder, you need more ATP because you're contracting more and you're engaging more myosin and actin binding sites. And from there, you just simply need, more ATP. This ATP is coming from bioenergetic pathways. We have our phosphocreatine, our glycolysis, which is the breakdown of glucose, and then oxidative phosphorylation, which is the use of oxygen to generate ATP. And at some point, your ability to generate ATP from the use of oxygen becomes limiting. So then we have to start to rely on glycolysis and phosphocreatine in order to make up for the ATP that we're, trying to generate. The problem is that we don't have enough ATP generation coming from phosphocreatine and glycolysis, or we don't have lasting ATP generation. So eventually those start to kind of run out. The fuel tank runs out. So then we run into issues of, being able to synthesize enough ATP. Another thing that happens is that as we contract harder and harder, as we exercise more intensely, more hydrogens and inorganic phosphate are being created or being created from the breakdown of ATP. And hydrogens, for the biochemistry people out there, they're actually called protons because they are positively charged hydrogen ions. So these protons are being created, which can then go and bind and actually interfere with the breakdown of, or with the further breakdown of ATP. Inorganic phosphates have also been shown to interfere with the breakdown of ATP. And there's also a secondary thing that happens where calcium, which is a positively charged ion, you'll see it, calcium with two plus signs, which means that it's got two positive charges on it, will interact with inorganic phosphate. And what happens is that calcium then precipitates, and you don't have the ability to reestablish calcium release upon contraction. Because what's happening with calcium, like we said earlier, is important for contraction to occur, is it's going in, or it's coming from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it's being released, it's binding to points or portions on myosin, and then after contraction is done, it's being sucked back in to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And eventually, you don't have that ability to release it and suck it back in, release it and suck it back in. So all of that being said, what seems to be the ultimate limiting factor, well, the reason why we fatigue is so our muscles don't blow themselves apart. It's a protective mechanism.
Right.
Because if we continue to be able to increase contraction, then we would be increasing our metabolic acidosis, and ultimately that would lead to the denaturing of proteins that are important for all the function of muscle to actually occur. So fatigue ultimately is a protective mechanism to keep us from basically blowing up, our ability to contract.
I have to laugh at that because, again, I've got a culinary degree, and so I went to school for cooking. And so when you cook a piece of meat, you're essentially denaturing it. You're denaturing the protein, and so we are essentially cooking ourselves.
That's exactly, not exactly, but as essentially what is happening. Because as you exercise harder, you're breaking down more ATP. The release of that third phosphate group on ATP releases heat, and actually that's mostly part of the reason why we generate more heat during exercise, is because of 80% of the energy that is being broken from that ATP being broken down is being released as heat. Right. So you have, increases in heat and increases in metabolic acidosis. And I'm sure you've seen, what is it, like ceviche, where they don't actually cook it in heat. They put lemon juice on it, and that cooks the fish.
Yep.
So if we don't have mechanisms to then control metabolic acidosis and temperature in place, then we are essentially cooking ourselves from the inside out. And the body there's a reason why humans are around still, is because the body has figured out ways to cope with runaway, like acidosis and heat and other things like that. And it's called at least from an exercise perspective, fatigue. Um,
Right.
so, so yeah, it's actually, pretty straightforward from that perspective. Is like, if you don't have structures in place, then ultimately what is going to limit your ability to contract, at least acutely, is, the metabolic acidosis, which hinders and interferes with contraction. Heat, to another extent. We've been talking about heat quite a bit, but I don't know if there's like truly like a mechanism for heat to stop or slow down contraction, other than more blood being shunted to the skin and not enough oxygen being uptaken by the muscle. So there's that. And then I think the ultimate question is okay, well, how do I get better at not cooking myself from the inside out? And that's where proper training comes in, right? In Dave, you and I have talked a lot about, specific training is going to lead to specific adaptations that allow you to specifically do the race you want to do, right? So if you're doing something that is like, a 3-hour race and you want to maintain 200 watts, then the most effective way of dealing with that in that internal environment is to put yourself, or to put your body through that internal environment. So you exercise at the same temperature, the same intensity, the same amount of time that you would for that race. The problem is that that's not really realistic, right? You can't just go and do a race every single day and hope that your body, adapts to it. So you have to build that volume over time, build that tolerance over time. And then ultimately, what's going to happen is your body is going to be able to better buffer and handle that metabolic acidosis. It's going to be better at dissipating that heat for longer at higher intensities. And then that is ultimately what is going to allow you to be more fatigue resistant. Is, your body is still going to fall apart at some point.
Right. We're trying to mitigate this.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to like eliminate it completely. We're just trying to mitigate it because there's always going to be some fall off. We just want it to be less.
Yeah. It's either going to be less or it's going to occur at a higher speed or higher intensity, right? That's what, increases in performance actually are doing. And so we've kind of talked all the way around. And I think one of the interesting things that I always appreciate, I studied, skeletal muscle mitochondria in my PhD. And one of the things that my PhD advisor would always talk about is that the mitochondria are actually the first source or first area of hydrogen ion or proton buffering. Because what happens is in order to actually make ATP via oxidative phosphorylation, you have to take protons off of certain substrates and sequester them, push them into the inner mitochondrial membrane, or the matrix, the inner membrane space. I'm remembering my anatomy now. So you have to push those into the inner membrane space, which is really specialized pockets called the cristae. But in order to do that, you have to have hydrogens around at some point, because you bind the hydrogens, you bind the electron, and then you can take those hydrogens off ultimately, and then make a specific area of high hydrogen concentration. And then when you let those hydrogens back in, it's actually that mechanical energy that spins a rotor within your mitochondria that smashes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with an inorganic phosphate and a hydrogen back together and creates ATP again.
Which is, and this is something we've talked about before, and it comes up over and over again, is that so much of exercise science, or the things we see, is just keeping the ATP like at a constant level, right? Like constantly replenishing it.
Yeah, that's how I teach my exercise physiology courses. Is exercise, we are trying to maintain ATP concentrations as exquisitely as possible, and our body is actually phenomenal at doing it. When you look at, how ATP concentrations change, from low intensity exercise to high intensity exercise, there's almost no change,
which is crazy.
Yeah, right. It's absolutely insane. But what does change is the amount of other metabolites, protons, inorganic phosphates, adenosine diphosphate, other things like that. Those are actually highly, highly in flux.
Yeah.
So ATP is the ultimate goal. And I would say, ATP generated from the use of oxygen, because that is essentially an infinite process. If we have the ability to continue to use more and more and more oxygen to generate ATP, then we're going to spare glycogen and phosphocreatine. And ultimately, we know there's some connection, with glycogen depletion and fatigue as well. We're not going to go into that, because we only have a few more minutes left here. But yeah, so I think overall, from an acute perspective, we're not. Chronic fatigue is I said I wanted to mention it. We're not going to actually talk about that because I'm not 100% sure on all the mechanisms of it. I think there is something going on where, the brain is dictating, there's some level of not being able to actually perpetuate that signal into the muscle anymore. So you kind of get this weird, half signal. And that's why people are kind of stumbling around and stuff, because you just lose control of your muscle contraction at that point. But with acute fatigue, an increase in acidosis, which is concomitant to inorganic phosphate increases, is going to interfere with our body's ability to, reestablish ion gradients, reestablish calcium gradients, reestablish, or just in general, break down ATP at the level of the contractile elements of the muscle, which is then going to ultimately decrease our rate of force production. And again, that's a protective mechanism to keep us from essentially destroying ourselves from the inside out. And then putting yourself in positions of that similar chemical and metabolic milieu for extended periods of time without overdoing it, that is going to provide the level of adaptation that is necessary for you to build the endurance capacity that you want for a certain race or a specific race distance and power output and other things like that.
Yeah, and I just want to, because we are coming up on time, I guess I want to kind of bring this back to, I know we always harp on specificity. And so I think this is a challenge with people that maybe train inside all the time, whether they're training on an indoor trainer or training on a treadmill or something. You can get really fit, but then taking it outside to the real world and you have all these external factors can blunt that fitness if you're not prepared for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you're putting yourself into an environment where maybe the heat is going to be a little bit different, and the metabolic acidosis is going to be a little bit lower, right? Or just the actual application of what it is you are doing is also different. And this is something I don't know if we've talked about it on the podcast, but like erg mode versus kind of free ride mode. Erg mode is definitely different, than having to generate your own power constantly over time.
Right.
So, so there's ways, and ultimately the body is just going to specifically adapt to the specific stress that you're putting upon it. And with the goal of, becoming essentially more fatigue resistant, which it then allows you to perform your race, even better.
Yeah. And I think what I'll just, one last thing I'll mention here is, we've talked about this before, is the hyper optimization and getting so caught up on improving these physiological thresholds or whatever, whether it's VO2 max or maximal lactate steady state. But really, when we're out racing, it's messy. You're using all these different energy systems, all these different contraction rates and everything else. And it's really focusing on preparing for the demands of that event versus just the different physiological aspects are super important.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't get so lost in the weeds here. Don't be like, oh, I'm going to specifically do metabolic acidosis training. It's like, no.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's the reason why most training programs have low intensity, high intensity, and moderate intensity days are because you need to stress the body in all of those levels. And then as you get closer to your race, you need to stress the body at a level that is commensurate with the race that is actually going to happen. Like, it's as complicated yet as simple as that.
Right.
You know, we're not going to go out and be like, oh, we're doing lactate tolerance day today, because lactate is just one thing in, you know, like the myriad of things that actually adapts when you're racing or riding at, you know, whatever we call second threshold, or, you know, 3 hour pace or 1 hour pace or whatever it is. So, you know, I think, like, don't get lost in the physiology, but it is nice to know what is actually happening, because then you can have a better idea of, well, if I do zone 2 work, you know, then most likely I'm probably not going to be putting myself in as much of a, you know, shift in metabolic acidosis and other things like that, compared to if I was just riding like at or slightly above my second threshold, which is going to be closer to where my race is.
Right.
Yep. So yeah. So what are your takeaways here, Dave?
Yeah, I think my takeaways like this, or with this, is fatigue is complex, and we can better prepare ourselves for it by training specifically to the demands of the race.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree with that. I think I love talking about the physiology, but I will say it's really nice to know, because then you can kind of have an idea of, you know, what is going on when I am getting tired and other things like that. But just know that, again, it's just another kind of tool in your tool belt, and don't get so lost in it that you lose sight of all of the other things that you have to do to actually perform at a high level.
Yep. Love it.
Cool. All right. So as always, you guys can catch me on Instagram at Critical02. Feel free to ask any questions, suggest topics, other things like that. You can comment down below if you're on YouTube. If you're enjoying these episodes, please go over to Spotify and give us a 5-star review. It really helps out the show. You can catch other episodes of Fast Physiology on Dave's podcast, Training Babble. We kind of do an every other week, you know, sort of thing, where we post these short episodes just on one endurance topic. And you can reach out to Dave at Kaizen Endurance if you have any questions or anything like that for him.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you in the next one.